the characters who were on the scene, and perhaps I shouldn't have called them characters, those individuals who were on the scene of the situation, the wounded man. Then look at some of the contrasting responses of those individuals that were on the scene of the wounded individual. And then the cost of responding in love to the wounded man. There's always a cost in responding as a Good Samaritan. There's always some degree of risk, and he experienced both of these. Let's look at the circumstances. Verse 30, just the first part. And Jesus answering said, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. We'll stop there. He went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Let me share with you a little bit of background here when it talks about he went down from Jerusalem down to Jericho. That's not just a figure of speech. The experience, let me share with you a little bit of the history of this area and the distance. It's about 20 miles from Jerusalem to Jericho, but it's a very difficult 20 miles, a very risky 20 miles. Let me share with you some comments here from a commentary. First, the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was a notoriously dangerous road. Jerusalem is 2,300 feet above sea level. The Dead Sea, near Jericho, where Jericho stood, is about 1,300 feet below sea level. So then in somewhat of less than 20 miles, this road dropped 3,600 feet. It was a road of narrow, rocky areas, sudden turnings, which made it a happy hunting ground for brigands and robbers. In the 5th century, Jerome tells that it was still called the Red or the Bloody Way. In the 19th century, it was still necessary to pay safety money to the local sheiks before one could travel on it. As late as the 1930s, Morton tells us that he was warned to get home before dark if he intended to use the road, because a certain sheik was adept at holding up cars, robbing travelers and tourists, and escaping into the hills before the police could arrive. When Jesus told this story, he was telling about the kind of thing that was constantly happening on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. So that kind of changes the dynamics, doesn't it? It was an area that was very risky, 20 miles, but the 20 miles was difficult traveling, and there were constantly individuals being robbed. And so the basic philosophy was, if you traveled this road, you didn't travel the road by yourself, and especially if you were carrying any kind of trade goods or money, and this was a major travel, kind of a trade area, you didn't travel by yourself. You traveled with at least one other person who could protect you. There was a system that the robbers had, and this kind of helps to frame what we're going to be hearing about the story. The situation was that basically you might be traveling down the road, when I say down, literally down, through very rocky, steep, difficult areas, and you look over and you see somebody who's wounded. And the natural response for normal people is to be concerned about that person. So oftentimes, they would go over to kind of investigate to see if they could help this person who was wounded. 2 people would come out from behind rocks, beat them up and rob them and take the goods that they had and then disappear. That may help in terms of, as we look at these individuals who were present and passed by the individual who was wounded. So this area had a history, and not a good history to say the least. In verse 30, the individual that we're talking about here who was traveling this road was a Jew. He was of Jewish descent. He was traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. Jerusalem down to Jericho. He was vulnerable to the attack of robbers. And interestingly enough, he was traveling alone, which was a no-no, to say the least. Let's look at the condition of the man. verse 30, second part of the verse. And he fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment and wounded him and departed, leaving him half dead. So he fell among robbers. They stripped his garments. They wounded him. They robbed him and left him for dead. That was the condition. So he's alongside the road, near death, and we have the entrance of a number of individuals passing by. Characters, I guess we could call them just participants in this experience. There was, first of all, look at verse 31, Luke 10:31. The first person to pass by was the priest, a priest. And by chance, there came down a certain priest that way. And when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. He was on his way down to Jericho as well. I guess professionally he was on vacation. And he didn't want to become involved in this situation at all with this individual who's alongside the road. Now, I guess we could say that if you remember the history I just read to you a little bit about the road, and read the fact that oftentimes robbers would use that as a ploy in order to attack individuals and take the goods, we could probably say, well, he was just being cautious. But he was a priest, all right? His responsibility was to do what? To care about people, to be concerned about people, to reach out and respond to people. But he didn't do that. He passed by on the other side. We have another individual coming up who's going to pass by this situation, these circumstances. Let's look at the Levite. Look at the next verse. And by chance there came down a certain, verse 32. And likewise, a Levite, when he was at the place, came and looked on him and passed by on the other side. Now, it's interesting because the indication here of Scripture is that he came closer. He didn't just see him at a distance and then pass by on the other side. He came up a little bit closer. Now, the Levites, of course, if they touched anybody who was dead, they had to isolate themselves from people, and they couldn't serve for a period of, I think it was about 7 days. And so basically he came close enough to see, he could kind of look, like at Jeff. He's looking, checking him out, but he moved away. He passed by on the other side too. Interesting, because there two individuals had the potential of offering help to reach out to this individual who was next to death, and they turned their backs and went their way. I guess the Levite's position was better safe than sorry. Better safe than sorry. Plus, he didn't want to come. If he was dead, he didn't want to touch him. He didn't want to come that close to him. We go next to an individual who comes upon the man who is next to death, and the most unlikely of people. This is the individual you would think might be part of the conspiracy to rob him or to hurt him in some way, because the Samaritans were not friends with the Jews at all. He is the most unlikely of individuals to reach out to this individual who is next to death. But there's a process that this man, basically the Samaritan, goes through in the situation as he observes what's happening here. Let's look at verses 34 and 35. Verse 33, but a certain Samaritan as he journeyed came where he was. Now there are a number of things that happen here. They're sequential that I think are really important. First of all, it says, and he what? He saw him. He saw where he was. And when he saw him, the second thing that happened was he had compassion on him. There's an interesting thing, I think, that's happening in our society today. The newspapers, television stations carry it. Individuals are attacked, and people watch. And what happens is they take their cameras and they actually record the event, but they don't reach out to help at all. And sometimes what happens is that the person who's arrested for the particular crime, if and when they are arrested, they have no emotions whatsoever about killing people, about harming them. In psychology, it's simply called flat affect, no emotion. And they can be questioned, and they can be put through all kinds of questions and investigation and so forth, and they just sit. And when the court comes, and if they're found guilty, basically, they sit. There's absolutely no emotion at all. It's called flat affect. That was not the case of the Good Samaritan. He basically saw him, and he had compassion on him. And the next thing is, not only did he see him, he had compassion on him, but he went to him. And the next step is he bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and brought him to an end, and took care of him. Now you remember this individual who, the Good Samaritan, is on his way to, obviously, to some kind of business. He has some concern about he needs to take care of in Jericho. And he sees this Jewish man is fallen among thieves, beaten up half dead, and he responds. But the sequence is really important. Binds him up, puts him on his own animal, takes him to an end. The process of doing that, in the process of doing that, basically, he expresses a concern. And we could say he expresses love. At least he expresses concern. He's willing to act. He's willing to put himself at risk. He's willing to reach out to this individual he doesn't know. And he, by the way, as he approaches that individual, doesn't know whether this is a setup or not. He doesn't know whether this is a setup by thieves or not. But he still reaches out to him and expresses a concern and brings him to the end. Now you'll remember that, well, let's look at the next verse here. And he brought him to an end and took care of him. Verse 35. And on the morrow, when he departed, he took out 2 pence and gave them to the host and said to him, take care of him. Whatever thou spendest more, when I come again, I will what? I'll repay. Now remember, this Samaritan apparently had traveled this way before. Because he's saying, I'll give you a certain amount of money to take care of him at this point. And if it costs more, when I return, I'll make up the difference. He had some credibility with the innkeeper. He was not just an individual who, well, just happened to come by this way, and it was a one-time deal. And he also responded to helping the man. He was willing to expend his own resources to help the wounded man. The cost, if we look at the cost, I guess we could say that the Good Samaritan was a first responder in a real sense in terms of today in our culture, a first responder. Talk about the cost of loving and reaching out to his neighbor. Just a couple of things come to mind. First of all, and I mentioned this, he took a risk because he didn't know whether or not the possibility, he didn't know that this wasn't a setup, and robbers would attack him and he'd be in the same situation without any help whatsoever. Secondly, he used his resources. He gave the innkeeper the funds to take care of him. And he said, when I come back this way, any difference I'll make up. He used his own oil and his own bandages and so forth and wrapped him up and on the way to take him to the end to take care of him. There was also the cost, and it was a positive cost, though. It was an investment. His caregiving was an investment for the Jewish man, and it was also an investment for him. There's an interesting thing about caring for people. When you reach out to people and you help people, there are all kinds of studies that indicate that the effect is not only the person who you help has benefit, but also you have a benefit as well by reaching out to them. It creates a sensitivity. We talk about empathy in our culture today. Very little empathy in our culture today, at least from my perspective. But empathy says that I reach out, I care about you. I'm going to reach out to you and I'm going to respond to your needs. I'm willing to help you. And we go now to the next part. We're back to the lawyer who asked the question because he was trying to box Christ in. Not a smart move. Not a smart move. And I won't comment about lawyers. My son-in-law is a lawyer, so I'll be careful. Basically, look at verse 36. Now, this is Christ speaking to him. Now he's asking the lawyer a question. He's saying, which now of these thinkest thou was a neighbor unto him that fell among thieves? It's called returning the monkey to the sender. And he said, he that showeth mercy on him. Then said Jesus unto him, go and do likewise. Do you notice anything about the lawyer's response in verse 37? Kind of an interesting, well, at least to me it's interesting. He doesn't call him a Samaritan. He doesn't refer to him as a Samaritan. He's not going to call him a Samaritan. He who rendered, he. But he's not going to mention he's a Samaritan. Let's take a look at some of the possible applications in terms of this passage that we have here in the story of the Good Samaritan. The reality is that we live in a world today where people are hurting. People are hurting. People are in pain, physical pain, psychological pain. People stressed beyond limits at times. And we see that. We see people just basically coming to the end of the rope, the COVID-19 problem, where people were isolated for a period of time. The end result was that suicides increased, depression increased. There were studies that indicated back in 2012, when the CCD did a research project and spent millions of dollars, that basically the masks didn't help particularly, and when you isolate people, it has negative effects on their mental health. And that was mentioned, but it was completely eliminated. But the effects of that are being felt by kids today, and they're also being felt by adults. And one of the aspects of this is that churches were shut down for a period of time, and it had an effect on churches as well. Had an effect on us as individuals, because we're designed to be social beings. We like to have contact, generally speaking. Now, there are times we like to be by ourselves. We like that isolation a little bit. But we like to fellowship with each other, and there's a sense of camaraderie. There's a sense of encouragement. We can encourage each other when we get together. But that didn't happen. And so the result was we're beginning to experience the results of that isolation that occurred. But there are people around us. We live in a world that basically is changing so fast. Picked up a new book today written by a man from Wall Street Journal on technology, and his comment was that the speed with which change is occurring is unparalleled. He said it is difficult for us as individuals to keep up with the changes and the speed of change that's occurring. But there are individuals not just out there, outside in our world, but let me suggest to you that as Christians, all of us have experienced at times a sense of pain, a sense of isolation, a sense of being overwhelmed. And that can happen to Christians. The Apostle Paul was depressed at one point, and God sent an individual to him, and he made the comment that individual encouraged him. It was a source of support for him as well. But in church today, among Christian circles, all of us struggle at times. And we can be, in effect, a good Samaritan, not a Samaritan in that sense, racially, but in the sense that we reach out and we respond to people and we pay attention to them. We pay attention to cues that we see. And when you get to know people, pretty soon you can tell. You can pick up pretty quickly on the fact that they're not responding normally the way they would respond. They seem to be down. They seem to be preoccupied with something. And it's really critical, in my estimation, to at least express a concern about those individuals, to say to them, are you okay? Can I help you in any way? Because all of us at particular times need somebody to reach out, somebody to notice that we're struggling. And we don't have to tell them the whole story. They don't have to tell you the whole story. We just need to know that they're struggling. And we can pray for them and remember them in prayer. And that provides some support to them. And sometimes, and I said this a number of times, and you're probably tired of hearing it now, but sometimes just listening is really critical. I'm not sure I can emphasize that enough. Because what happens is our emotions go up, our thinking process goes down. And there's a point at which, if our emotions get so high, we can't listen anymore. We can hear, but we can't listen. We can't absorb data. We can't take in data. So when you give advice to a person who's upset, they can't absorb that. Doesn't matter who they are or what their background is. They can't absorb it. But what listening does, it's like a balloon. The more the emotions go, the balloon gets bigger. Use your imagination. This is a virtual balloon, okay? And you don't have to worry about it blowing up either. So as the emotions grow, the balloon gets bigger, and what it does is it distorts our ability to see things clearly. And it also blocks out things. We can't take in information. And we can see on the side, we can take in things to a degree, but the larger that gets, the more difficult it is for us to function and think things through clearly and process things. But what listening does is it enables that balloon to begin to unload some of that air, that hot air, the experiences the person is going through, and the balloon begins to shrink. And as the balloon begins to shrink, what happens is they begin to be able to see more clearly, and they begin to even understand what they're going through. And the value of listening is that somebody cares, and in my expressing the problem that I'm going through to that person, I actually begin to understand my problem more effectively than I did before. And that sounds like an oversimplification. I assure you it's not. And all of us have had the experience, hopefully, of struggling, and somebody listened. And afterwards, after they listened, and maybe didn't offer any suggestions at all, because just kind of getting it out is critical, we say to them what? Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening. And then sometimes we say what? Well, I really didn't do anything. See, we don't understand the value of listening. There's another aspect too. All of us have experienced wounding, being wounded at some times and are in need of care. The second application is it's not the one who professes to love others, but the one who will deny themselves and reach out to others in their time of need. And that's one thing about, as Christians, you remember the comment? that those who in the New Testament who were not Christians, their comment was about Christians, we know they're Christians because they love one another. They reach out to one another. But not just reaching out to other Christians, but non-Christians too. It becomes an opportunity for sharing the gospel at times. In spite of the differences between us, we are instructed to love our enemies and to reach out and express a concern and respond to their needs. The lawyer left. Hopefully he thought about what Christ said rather than just return to his day-to-day routine without realizing the message that Christ had given him. The Good Samaritan, reaching out to a person who normally he wouldn't speak to because he saw that person in need and was willing to help them and make a difference in their lives. And we as Christians have the opportunity to do that every day. There are all kinds of opportunities, little things, little opportunities. But often those little opportunities become really critical to changing people's lives and opening the door to their receptivity to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thank you.